In 1984, a man was found naked and dying inside his crashed car, but the autopsy proved the crash hadn't killed him. This is the YOGTZE case, and it only gets darker. It was the autumn of 1984 inches, the quiet community of Unsolved, West Germany. Here, a 34-year-old food engineer named Günther Stoll lived an ordinary life until he stepped into a mystery that continues to defy all logic 40 years later. On a cold evening in late October, Günther sat in his living room, consumed by a heavy, suffocating silence. His wife watched him with growing concern as he paced, his mind clearly elsewhere. Suddenly, he leapt from his chair, his eyes wide with a frantic, sudden clarity. He shouted, "Now I've got it!" He grabbed a scrap of paper and a pen, hastily scribbling down 6 cryptic letters, YOGTZE. But before his wife could even ask what the code meant, he violently crossed the letters out, threw the paper aside, and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. He had no coat, no explanation, and no destination. Within hours, he would be found dying. Those 6 letters, instantly discarded and later lost, would become the only to a labyrinth of terror that no investigator has ever been able to navigate. Was it a license plate, a radio frequency, or something far more sinister? We may never know, but the sequence remains the heartbeat of Germany's most baffling cold case. Today we are going to retrace Günther Stoll's final, frantic footsteps through the German night. We will look at the bizarre trail he left behind, the chilling encounters he had in the dark, and the medical impossibility that baffled the nation's top forensic experts. This is a story where every single piece of evidence seems to contradict the next, and where the victim himself seemingly predicted his own brutal, inexplicable demise. If you find yourself drawn to these unsolved mysteries that challenge the very fabric of reality, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We dive into the world's most baffling cases every single week, and your support helps us keep these investigations alive. The YOGTZE case is widely considered Germany's most famous impossible murder, a puzzle that has haunted detectives for decades. Let's peel back the layers of that cold October night and see if we can finally decode the madness that took Günther Stoll's life. To understand the sheer bizarre nature of that night, we have to look at the world Günther was living in. In 1984, Unshausen was a sleepy, industrial-adjacent town where everyone knew their neighbors. Günther was a food engineer, a profession requiring precision, logic, and a grounded mind. But lately, his mind had been anything but grounded. After suffering a long period of unemployment, a dark, suffocating cloud had descended upon him. He spent his days pacing the floors of his home, his behavior growing increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He would spend hours looking out the windows, checking the street, and obsessively testing the locks on the doors. He had developed a profound, terrifying paranoia that consumed his every waking thought. He began whispering to his wife about a mysterious group of people he simply called them. He was utterly convinced that these unknown figures were watching his every move and that they were planning to cause him severe physical harm. His wife tried her best to comfort him, chalking his fears up to the severe depression brought on by the loss of his job. To the outside world, there was no evidence of any enemies or any conspiracy. But in Günther's mind, the threat was as real as the cold autumn wind rattling the windows of their home, a shadow that refused to be ignored. Gunther was not a man prone to wild fantasies before this darkness took hold of his life. Friends and former colleagues remembered him as a mild-mannered, intelligent man who loved his hometown and enjoyed a quiet, occasional pint at the local pub. Losing his livelihood had stripped away his identity, leaving a raw, vulnerable nerve in its place. The tragedy of Gunther Stoll is the tragedy of a man watching his own mind betray him, or perhaps the terrifying tragedy of a man who saw a real threat that nobody else was willing to believe. When he fled his house that night, leaving the crossed-out code on the table, he wasn't just running away. He was fleeing from a terror that had been building inside him for months. He climbed into his white Volkswagen Golf, a common and unassuming car, and drove off into the pitch-black night. He wasn't driving aimlessly, though. He was seeking refuge, or perhaps trying to finally confront the very demons he had been warning his wife about. As he moved onto the isolated rural roads, the silence of the German countryside only amplified the deep, unsettling dread that was silently consuming him from the inside out. He was heading toward a destination only he understood, unaware that he was driving toward his own end. The first stop on Gunther's erratic journey was the neighboring municipality of Wilnsdorf. He pulled up to the Papillon, a local pub where he was a known face, likely seeking the comfort of a familiar environment. It was late, and the air outside was biting, but the pub offered a brief sanctuary of warmth and low light. Gunther walked in and ordered a beer, his demeanor appearing tense, but otherwise functional to those behind the bar. However, before he could even take a single sip, the situation took a terrifying turn. Witnesses watched in shock as Gunther suddenly collapsed, falling face first onto the hard floor without any warning. The impact was so violent that it left him with a significant injury to his face, bleeding and clearly dazed. While the other patrons assumed he might have been heavily intoxicated, the witnesses were adamant that he had not consumed a drop of alcohol that night. It was as if his nervous system had simply buckled under the weight of his internal terror. He eventually pulled himself up, wiped the blood from his skin, refused any offers of medical assistance, and staggered back out into the freezing night, leaving his full glass of beer sitting untouched on the bar. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Gunther had driven to Heigerseelbach, the town where he had spent his childhood. He arrived at the home of a longtime friend, pounding on the door with a desperation that suggested he was being hunted. When she finally opened the door, she was met with a sight that was purely nightmarish. Gunther stood on her porch, his face still bleeding from his earlier fall at the pub, his eyes wide with a frantic, unblinking panic. In a trembling voice, he told her that a horrible incident was going to take place that very night. He begged for a place to stay, yet he adamantly refused to go to his own parents' house, which was located just a short distance away. It seemed that in his state of heightened paranoia, he no longer felt he could trust even his own blood. His friend, deeply unsettled by his appearance and the late hour, tried to calm him down. She didn't realize the true gravity of the situation, believing his behavior was simply a manifestation of his recent struggles with unemployment. She eventually persuaded him to return home to his wife, promising him that everything would look better in the morning light. The German Autobahn is a marvel of engineering, a high-speed network that usually represents efficiency and progress. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, the A45 stretch near Hagen Sud becomes a desolate, lonely place. It is a corridor of shadows, traveled almost exclusively by long-haul truckers who are well acquainted with the dangers of the road. Fatigue and the hypnotic rhythm of the pavement can often lead to accidents, and the police who patrol these routes are used to seeing the aftermath of high-speed collisions. They understand how metal crumples and how vehicles behave when they leave the asphalt at 100 kilometers per hour. Usually, the scene of a crash tells a clear story of a driver falling asleep or a mechanical failure. But on this particular October morning, the responding officers were about to encounter a scene that contradicted every rule of forensic science they had ever learned. Nothing in their training could have prepared them for the state of the vehicle, or the condition of the man they were about to find inside it. The quiet of the countryside was about to be shattered by a discovery that would remain unexplained for over 40 years. Gunther's childhood friend would spend the next 40 years haunted by the choice she made that night. When a man appears on your doorstep at 1 in the morning, bleeding and speaking of an impending catastrophe, the logical response is often clouded by the desire for normalcy. She saw his fear, but she interpreted it through the lens of his known mental struggles, assuming that home and a night of rest were the best remedies. It is a devastating moral dilemma that many of us might fail. How do you distinguish between a psychological crisis and a genuine mortal warning? She watched him walk back to his car, never imagining it would be the last time he was seen alive. Instead of returning to his wife as promised, Gunther drove his white Volkswagen Golf back into the void. He embarked on a 100-kilometer journey that took him far from safety and deep into the rural darkness. For 2 hours, his movements remained a complete blank on the map of that night. No one knows where he went or who he might have encountered in those final silent miles before the A45 became his final destination. At approximately 3 in the morning, 2 truck drivers moving along the A45 noticed a glint of white reflecting in their headlights near the Hagen Sud exit. Down in a steep trench off the side of the highway, they spotted a crashed Volkswagen Golf. They immediately pulled over and scrambled down the embankment, expecting to find a driver trapped behind the wheel. What they discovered instead defied all logic. The car was mangled, but the driver's seat was empty. Gunther Stoll was found slumped in the passenger seat, suffering from massive, catastrophic injuries that left him on the brink of death. If you are finding this investigation into the impossible as gripping as we are, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the world's most baffling cases. Beyond the violence of the crash, the one detail stood out as truly chilling. Despite the freezing October temperatures, Gunther Stoll was completely and entirely naked. Not a single scrap of clothing remained on his body, and his clothes were nowhere to be found inside the wreckage. He was shivering, bleeding, and alone in the dark. Despite the horrific extent of his trauma, Gunther was miraculously conscious when the truck drivers reached the wreck. They knelt beside him, trying to keep him focused as they waited for the sirens of the ambulance to crest the hill. When they asked what had happened, Gunther managed to whisper a statement that would haunt the investigation for the next 4 decades. He told them that there had been 4 other men in the car with him. According to his fading voice, these men had beaten him severely before fleeing into the dark woods surrounding the Autobahn. When the truckers asked if these men were his friends, Gunther weakly shook his head and replied that they were strangers. It was the last meaningful thing he would ever say. The paramedics arrived and carefully extracted his naked, broken body from the passenger seat, racing toward the nearest hospital in a desperate attempt to save him. But the damage was too severe. Gunther Stoll passed away in the back of the ambulance, leaving behind a mystery that would only grow more impossible the more the police looked at the evidence. Let's take a moment to look closely at the timeline, because this is where the fabric of the story begins to tear apart. Gunther Stoll pulled away from his childhood friend's house in Heigerseelbach at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. He was discovered in that ditch near Hagen at 3 o'clock. The distance between those 2 points is roughly 100 kilometers. Driving at normal highway speeds in 1984, that journey should have taken him a little under an hour. Yet 2 full hours had elapsed. There is a missing hour in Gunther's final night that remains a complete void. Where was he during that time? Was he meeting the 4 strange men he later mentioned to the truck drivers? Was he abducted, or was he desperately trying to outrun someone? And then there is the most disturbing question of all. Why was he completely naked? Investigators scoured the crash site and the surrounding woods with flashlights and search dogs, looking for his clothes, looking for the footprints of the 4 fleeing men, or looking for any sign of a struggle in the damp earth. They found absolutely nothing. There was no torn fabric caught on the brambles, no discarded shoes, and no trail through the wet autumn leaves. It was as if the 4 men and every stitch of Gunther's clothing had simply vanished into the thin, cold air of the German night. The police initially treated the case as a bizarre, but ultimately straightforward traffic fatality. They assumed that Gunther, suffering from a severe mental health crisis, had undressed himself in a state of delirium, a documented phenomenon sometimes seen in extreme hypothermia or psychosis, and then crashed his car in a blind panic. The story about the 4 men was easily dismissed as the dying hallucination of a man with a known history of paranoia. It was a convenient theory that neatly wrapped up the loose ends. However, in Germany, any unexpected or suspicious death requires a thorough post-mortem examination. Gunther's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where forensic pathologists began the grim task of documenting his injuries. They painstakingly examined the crushing trauma to his chest, the internal bleeding, and the severe abrasions across his skin. As they charted the damage, the pathologists started to notice something fundamentally wrong. The pattern of the injuries did not match the geometry of the wrecked Volkswagen Golf. The steering wheel was intact. The dashboard didn't have the corresponding impact marks that should have been there if he had been thrown against it. The wounds were entirely inconsistent with a car crash. In fact, the more they looked, the more they realized he hadn't been injured inside that car at all. When the final autopsy report was submitted, it sent shockwaves through the entire police department. The forensic evidence proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Gunther Stoll's fatal injuries were not caused by the crash in the ditch. The horrific crushing damage to his body was the result of being run over by a completely different vehicle. But the revelations didn't stop there. The pathologists determined that when he was run over, he was already completely naked. Most terrifying of all, the microscopic debris and tire marks found on his skin proved that he was run over at a different, unknown location. Suddenly, all the pieces of the puzzle shifted into a terrifying new picture. There was the paranoia, the crossed-out code, and the 4 strangers. It wasn't a hallucination. The they he feared were real. Someone, or some group of people, had stripped Gunther naked, run him over with a vehicle in an undisclosed location, and then picked up his bleeding, dying body. They had driven him to the A45 Autobahn, placed him carefully into the passenger seat of his own car, and intentionally ghost-ridden the vehicle down the embankment into the ditch. It was a meticulously staged, impossible murder. The accident was a lie, a theatrical performance designed to hide a much darker truth. This was the moment the investigation transformed from a traffic accident into one of the most baffling homicide cases in European history. The sheer logistical nightmare of this crime is staggering when you truly think about the sequence of events. Consider the scene. A dark, isolated location somewhere in the German countryside. A man is stripped of his clothes. He is run down by a heavy vehicle, his body crushed beneath the tires. But instead of leaving him there to die in the dirt, the perpetrators stop. They get out. They lift a severely bleeding, heavy, and agonizingly conscious man into the passenger seat of his own white Volkswagen. Then, one of them has to get into the driver's seat of that blood-soaked car, sitting right next to the dying victim, and drive it out onto the Autobahn. They have to find the perfect spot, line the car up with a steep trench, put it in gear, and let it roll down into the darkness to simulate an accident. Who would go to such incredibly elaborate, risky lengths just to mask a murder as a car crash? And more importantly, why? If the goal was simply to kill Gunther, leaving him in the woods would have been far easier and much less likely to draw attention. The staging of the crash suggests a level of calculation that borders on the ritualistic. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a bizarre, choreographed display that left the police chasing ghosts for decades. The revelation turned the case into a massive national manhunt. The police released the details of the cryptic note, asking the public for any help decoding those 6 letters, YOGTZE. Thousands of tips poured in from across the country. Some thought it was an anagram for a Romanian yogurt flavor. Others believed it was a call sign for a clandestine ham radio operator. Some even speculated it was the license plate of the mystery vehicle that had run him over. The case was even featured on the famous television show YOGTZE, XY, Ungelöst, bringing the mystery into millions of German homes. But despite decades of investigation, police interviews, and endless public speculation, the code has never been cracked. The identities of the 4 men Gunther saw remain a complete mystery. The location where he was actually run over has never been found, and his clothes were never recovered. The case of Gunther Stoll has become a legendary black hole in German criminal history. It is a story where the victim literally wrote down the answer hours before his death, yet 40 years later, no one can read it. The truth remains locked behind those 6 letters, scrawled in a moment of frantic clarity. We are left with the chilling realization that true paranoia is only a delusion until the moment it becomes reality. Gunther Stoll spent his final months terrified of a shadowy group of people he believed were coming for him. Everyone told him he was crazy. Everyone told him it was just in his head. But in the end, the monsters he feared stepped out of the shadows and proved him right in the most brutal way imaginable. His final desperate act was an attempt to leave us a key, a 6-letter cipher that holds the truth to a perfectly executed, impossible crime. If you want to join us in exploring more of the darkest, most baffling mysteries the world has to offer, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and search for the answers that have remained hidden for years. Until next time, remember that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are exactly what you think they are. The shadows might be closer than you think.